Washington, and Jason Furman from the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House in Washington. So we have the private sector and the public sector, both of whom are paid to figure where the global economy is going, what it means for America, what the risks are.
Different amounts.
Pay different amounts, exactly. And what it means for all of us. So perhaps we can start by asking you, Jason, when you look at the economy today in America, we've had a lot of talk about the recovery, a lot of optimistic noises coming from the White House, and yet we've just had a pretty disappointing set of economic data about the first quarter of this year. And frankly, if you go out into the streets and ask ordinary people, do you feel that we're in the middle of a recovery? Many people will say no. So how do you figure out that puzzle?
The ordinary people that come to the Aspen Ideas Festival, average ordinary people, right?
Yeah, I don't know how many of you actually would count yourself as ordinary or not, but yes.
Well, let me step back before we talk about the first quarter itself and say that we went through a massive recession, something that economists call the Great Recession, the worst shock to the economy since the Great Depression. In many ways, the shock that precipitated it was worse than the Great Depression. Wealth, for example, fell by 15% in the onset of this recession. In the onset of the Great Depression, it only fell by about 3%. We all know that growth is hard coming after financial crises. When businesses and individuals get over-leveraged running into a crisis, the normal mechanism of economic recovery, which is borrowing, spending, and investing, isn't operative in the same degree. You have to have a painful, prolonged period of deleveraging before you're in a position for stronger growth. If you compare the US recovery to other financial crises, you see that we reattained our per capita GDP a little bit over 4 years after the crisis. There were 11 other countries, 12 in total, including the United States, that went through financial crises of similar magnitude. The only other one that reattained its per capita GDP was Germany. France very recently did, and 9 others still haven't. So if you compare to those countries, we're well ahead. You compare to our history, we're well ahead. None of that's to say that we're growing as quickly as we'd like to grow, or as quickly as we need to grow, and we can get to some of the policy issues as we go along. I like to take that longer perspective on things and not drill down on any one quarter. The first quarter was confusing in that GDP contracted, but we actually added jobs. And it's very rare to see GDP fall this much while you're adding jobs, while industrial production is expanding, while auto purchases are rising, and a range of other economic indicators were in the positive. So I think there was something fluky about the data.
Do you think the data was actually wrong? I mean, are these statistics wrong?
I think the statistics will be revised 10 times over the next 10 years, and it'll end up being a different number than minus 2.9. But a bunch of it was something like inventories, which is a transitory thing and tends to reverse itself. The more recent data on jobs in the last couple of months, we've had 4 straight months of above 200,000 jobs. So I wouldn't pay that much attention to the fluctuation from quarter to quarter. I'd look at the average, and the average is decent. It's not as great as we'd want. And a lot of that decency, I think, traces back to the origin, which is the financial crisis.
Right. I'd just like to quickly check you're all awake by asking you, as a group, how many of you actually think there is a good recovery underway right now in America? Okay, well, that's pretty good news. How many of you think there isn't much of a recovery going, or even okay, well, that's not so good news. Fairly evenly split. David, what do you make of that?
Well, this reflects to some extent the nature of the recovery. When you have a recession, typically you get back to the GDP rate that you had, or at least the unemployment rate you had before the recession within 2 years, or about 2 years after the recession's over. And the recessions usually last about, I'd say, 9 months or so. Generally, we have recessions every 7 years, more or less, and since World War II, and generally they last 9 months. This one lasted more or less, you could say, 23 months. Theoretically, it ended in June of 2009. And interestingly, the US government doesn't tell you when a recession starts or when it ends because they don't want that responsibility. It's outsourced to the National Bureau of Economic Research. But they said at the end of June 2009 that the recession was over. And that means that was over more or less 5 years ago. So why do we feel like we're still in a very limp recovery? The reason, I think, is that the recovery has bifurcated. it has done very well in the last 5 years or so, and certainly the last 2 years or so, for the upper income people. The upper income people are doing quite well. They are getting richer than they've ever been. Not since 1929 has there been a gap between the upper income and the lower income as much as we now have. Corporations have record profits. They had corporate profits last year about $1.9 trillion. The investing environment is very good because interest rates are very, very low. Corporations are having no problems making money. They're having no problems in recruiting people to work for them. They are investing all over the world and doing quite well. But we are not really doing very well for the people who are making average incomes or less. Sometimes people forget in this environment what the average income is. Some people think that the average income might be, well, President Obama at one point said we're not going to raise income on the middle class. And he didn't want to do that, income taxes on the middle class. But when he said that, he said we're not going to raise taxes on $250,000 and below. But it turns out that really for a family of four, the median income is not $250,000, it's really $65,000. So for people who are making $65,000 and below, it's not been a very good recovery. For people who are graduating from college, it's not been a very good recovery. They are often living back at their parents' homes. For people who want to retire, it's not been a good recovery because they can't really afford to retire in the way that they thought they would be able to do so. Now, it's not any one person's fault. The economy is too gigantic. We have roughly a $17 trillion economy, and no $17 trillion economy can be blamed on any one factor. It's just been a very difficult recovery, and economic textbooks in future years will try to figure out what happened. But today, I think we have what I would call a bifurcated recovery. Very good for people like me, and very good for many people in this room, very good for people who are in the investment world, very good for upper income people, but for people who are at the bottom of the economic totem pole, for a lot of reasons that are demographic, a lot of reasons have to do with factors beyond anybody's control, we are not doing very well. And I think the recovery for people below the median income will probably be challenging for another year or two at least.
Right, well, not only very good for people in the upper echelons of the income groups, but also very good for sales of Thomas Piketty's book recently. One of the most fascinating statistics I recently saw was the fact that Thomas Piketty's book on inequality topped the New York Times bestseller list in a week when there were 2 literary adaptations of the movie Frozen.
Wow.
So the idea of French socialist economists writing about inequality could beat Frozen twice over is quite remarkable and a sign of the kind of concern that the points you're making.
It may be on the bestseller list. It won't be on the best read list.
Have you read it yourself?
I've tried. It's very dense. Remember, it's an English translation of something written in French and so forth. And it's, there are many people buy books because they think it's appropriate to carry them around and tell people they're reading them. But, and I have a lot of those too. But that is one that I don't think many people will get through to the end, at least non-economists.
Well,
There's a good test for anyone reading it, which is on page 330. He says the age of this character Rastignac from Balzac's Père Goriot, and he gets it wrong. So if you get to that page, discover that he has Rastignac's age wrong, you know the person's read it.
So have you read it?
I have.
All the way through?
He said I was the only one that pointed out that mistake.
And you read it in the original French?
No.
Has anyone else in the room read it? One.
Anybody bought it?
How many of you bought it?
Okay. All right.
That's not bad, right. Well, I mean, laughter aside, I mean, Piketty's book has sold extraordinarily well and beaten Frozen precisely because it does pick up the theme that Dave has just illuminated, and frankly, a theme that many of us in the room are very uneasy about because it raises questions about the American dream. I mean, were you surprised by the findings in his book, Jason?
Not surprised by them because he's been publishing them for the last decade. But for the economics profession as a whole, I think they have been quite a surprise. We relied mostly on census data before he came along. Census data asks you what your income is. If your income, it used to be 100,000, now it's 250, is above that, they just quote it as 250 plus. And you miss an enormous amount about what's going on in the economy, what's going on in inequality, if when somebody's income rises from 1 million to 2 million, that gets recorded as stayed at 250 plus to 250 plus. And what he did, he was one of the first 2 economists to do this, was to look at tax data. And your tax returns say everything about your income. You can't look at people's individual ones, but you can look at averages of them. And that was enormously illuminating. The other enormously illuminating thing that he did, and the strength of the book, is that rather than the conversation we just had about what was happening in the first quarter and was the May jobs report good or bad, he talks about two centuries of data. And economic forecasters often try to tell you the next quarter, the next year. His book includes a forecast of the next century. I think there's a decent chance that his forecast of the next century is wrong, but by having a bold, provocative forecast and simplifying it down to one force, I think he did us all a big service in terms of broadening the debate.
Well, the advantage of writing a book predicting what will happen a century down the road is that people probably won't be around to remind you that you were right or wrong. So it's a very tempting thing to do. And, you know, I would like to do that myself. I think that most people who are worried about income inequality today are focused on two things. One, how do we correct the problem in the next couple of years if we can? And how do we deal with the twin sister or twin brother of income inequality, which is social mobility? Income inequality is one problem, and I'm not sure that can be solved so quickly, but the problem of social mobility is a serious one as well. That is to say, people at the bottom of the economic totem pole not feeling that they can get above their economic surroundings that they were born into, more or less, or educated at a certain level. So that is a big problem. And the gap between social mobility is now getting bigger and bigger than it's been. In other words, people who are blue-collar workers or who have children who grew up in blue-collar families no longer feel as much as they did years ago that they can get to the upper economic strata. And that's a big problem for the American dream, so-called, because we used to believe that we could always work our way to the top. Now, increasingly, people don't feel that. And I think these are broad social issues that no administration and no set of individuals has a solution for, but it's something that we have to grapple with over the next couple of years, because both income inequality and social mobility not being as good as they should be are going to ultimately put a fissure between our society to the point where we're not going to really be able to be a functioning society to the extent that we want to be.
So Jason, I mean, given that, as you point out, we're worrying not about the next century, but about the next couple of years, and given that inequality appears to have actually grown during the Obama presidency, is there anything that the administration can do about this at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I'd want to say that I very much agree with David, and I think inequality and mobility are highly correlated. You look across counties in the United States, the counties that are the most unequal are also the hardest to advance from the bottom to the top. You look across OECD countries, you see the same pattern. Countries like Denmark that are very equal also have a lot of movement, and countries like the United States that are very unequal also have very little movement. So I think anything that helps to solve one will help to address the other. I think we want policies that operate on basically every time scale. We want things that matter right away today, and the biggest exemplar of that in the debate right now is the minimum wage. The minimum wage would raise wages for 28 million workers. That's about 1/6 of our workforce, either directly or indirectly through a ripple effect because their wages are near it. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, something like preschool. You look at the United States, we are 25th in the OECD in the percentage of 4-year-olds that are enrolled in preschool. Mexico is at 100%. The United States is, I can't remember, about 80%, maybe less than that. Having a high-quality preschool for every American would do an enormous amount for social mobility. It would do a lot for inequality. Wouldn't do anything that you'd see in the data for another 15 or 20 years until those children grow up and start to enter the labor force. So I think we need to do everything from now, until later.
Right.
The biggest problems I see in the economy today are not just economic inequality and social mobility, but the number of problems that came about because of the Great Recession. When the Great Recession came in, it's like, I like to use the analogy of a glacier. It came in like during the Ice Age, and it stayed for a long time, and then it went back, and it left a residue. The residue left by the Great Recession are greater income inequality, and I think lower social mobility than before, much greater deficit than we had before, much greater debt than we had before, a higher unemployment rate than we had before, and a lower unemployment rate, or higher unemployment rate than we had before. So we have to do a number of things to get the unemployment rate down. It's still higher than it should be, in my view. We still have to get the growth rate up to, I think 3% would be good this year. Because of the first quarter, we probably won't get to 3%. I think we also have to deal with the debt. People don't talk about it anymore in Washington, but we do have more or less $17 trillion of debt. And while as a percentage of GDP, it's not increasing, it's still debt that somebody's going to have to pay off, probably our children and grandchildren, and we can inflate our way out of it, but that's not going to solve the problem. We also have to deal with the deficit. It's gotten down to, this year should be maybe under 500 billion, but we can't pat ourselves on the back by getting $500 billion of annual deficit. It was 1.3 trillion, but it's still too high. And we have to deal as well with the fact that we have political stalemate. And I won't say all of these problems are due to the political stalemate, but I think the investment community and the business community to some extent thinks it would be better if various parts of the government would get together better and cooperate more. It's not any one person's fault or any part of Congress or part of the administration, but there's no doubt that when you're sitting around the world and looking at what the U.S. government's doing, the way it operates, it doesn't give as much confidence to people as you would like. So if we could ever solve that problem, it would be quite helpful. But these are the problems we have to address over the next couple of years, and hopefully something will get done in Washington that will make some progress in some of these things. I think right now we're not in danger of going into another recession, in my view again. I don't think we're in danger of a cataclysmic kind of thing happening that will all of a sudden put us in an economic tailspin, but I think we're going to more or less limp along at modest growth for a while and pretty more or less accept 6% or so unemployment when the marginally attached rate's really about 12%. So I think we're in a kind of a period of time that's not going to be very exciting.
Can I just ask though, I mean, if you're looking ahead at risks, one of the risks I'd like to talk about is the issue of monetary policy and quantitative easing. Because if you like, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or $2 trillion gorilla in the room, which people aren't really talking about right now, is the fact that the Federal Reserve and the other central banks have pumped an extraordinary amount of liquidity into the financial system. I was over at the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, in the last few days, meeting with a number of central bank governors. And if any of you are sort of monetary policy geeks, I would strongly recommend you read the report that's coming out later today from the BIS, which basically says, with the capital letters, watch out. The $10 trillion worth of total money that's been pumped in by central banks into the economy has distorted the financial system in a very fundamental way. And trying to find a way to get out of this situation is going to be extremely hard. So, I mean, Jason, what would you say to people who would argue that actually this recovery is illusory because it's basically floating on the wave of a lot of free money that at some point is going to vanish?
I would first of all say that the United States has been well served by the policy of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administration that federal officials don't comment on the Federal Reserve, which does its actions independently. So David can opine on QE. But when you look at the recovery, you ask yourself, how much real tangible investment is there in plant and equipment? How much residential construction is there? How much are consumers spending? All of those are the real economy, and then you ask how many people are employed producing all of those things. In that respect, it's been a real recovery. The unemployment rates come from 10 to 6.3. It's not all the way recovered. It hasn't gotten there as fast as you would have liked, but it's been a real tangible recovery, not one based on what feels to me like any type of unsustainable bubble or something unusual. If anything, we're still below the steady state value. Housing, for example, we're building 1 million units a year. We probably need to build 1.6 million units a year. But as to the particulars of QE, I'm sure David has an opinion.
My view, when the Federal Reserve System was set up under President Woodrow Wilson, it was designed to basically create a central monetary bank, not unlike exists in other countries, so that we could make sure that the money supply was appropriately controlled, not by political forces, and we didn't have inflation going out of control. It was more designed to control inflation. In the 1970s, we added the mandate of dealing with unemployment as well. And so the Federal Reserve really has two mandates, but it never really had a mandate to do things as aggressively as it did after the Great Recession happened. When the Great Recession happened, Ben Bernanke and the others in the Federal Reserve did, in my view, a heroic job of saving the economy from even a worse situation than we would have had. And they did things that nobody expected them to do, including TARP and a whole variety of other things. Quantitative easing is part of that, and I think we benefited by having it, but I think it was beginning to distort the economy. I think it's a good thing to get out of it, but getting out of it won't be that easy. It'll take some time. We'll be out of it probably by the end of this year, but then at some point, people believe that the Fed will begin to increase interest rates. We don't know when that will happen. The Federal Reserve Chairman has said that probably the Fed might increase interest rates maybe in the middle of next year, but depending on unemployment, other factors. And the anticipation of that is confusing the markets a bit. But I think the Federal Reserve deserves enormous credit, and Ben Bernanke particularly so, for getting us into quantitative easing, because I think it was very helpful. The economy was dragging, and the reason it was dragging is because the Congress was doing nothing. Because of various problems we've seen in Washington, the Fed was the only game in town, and had the Fed not acted, I don't think the administration or Congress could have done anything to stimulate the economy to the point that was necessary. Quantitative easing 3 or QE3 probably was not as necessary as QE1 or QE2, but we're now in the process of getting out of it. So I give the Fed a lot of credit, but as many of you know, when you start something, it's easy to get into something, sometimes not as easy to get out. And we're all in now what I would say is a case of first impression. Nobody really knows how to get out of something like QE3 without producing more inflation than probably you want, or without roiling the economy more than you want, or screwing up the economic growth that we would like.
But I mean, David, when you look at what's happening in the markets, and I'd love to hear some thoughts from Jason if you're able to comment on this, but when you look at this extraordinary situation where the stock market has been soaring way above what would normally be justified by the sort of real economic fundamentals, you've had the bond market soaring as well. You have extraordinarily tight spreads in many corners of the credit markets, and just about every single risky asset out there, from Zambian bonds through to cat bonds to everything else, is being sort of bid up aggressively. Are you not concerned at all by the thought that actually trying to get out of this extraordinary situation is going to spark a new financial crisis?
Well, you never know what's going to spark the financial crisis. Nobody really thought that subprime problems would spark the Great Recession. So you don't really know what it will be, and it could be some black swan we don't know about. So sometime there will be another recession, probably sparked by something we can't anticipate right now. There's no doubt that the distortion effect is this. When interest rates are kept so low by QE2 or 3, people get very low returns on their fixed income. So if you put your money in the bank, you're getting virtually no return. Put your money in a fixed income product, you're getting very modest return. So in order to chase returns, people are bidding up stocks or bidding up all kinds of exotic investment products, and that does have a distortion effect. The trick that the Federal Reserve has to deal with is how to figure out when it's appropriate to begin increasing interest rates without causing a panic on the market. And so far, every time the Fed indicates it might increase interest rates, the market panics a bit. And they've kind of gotten used to that at the Fed, but they recognize they have to be very careful what they say, because the markets tend to overreact to whatever the Fed says. Right now, I would say for the remainder of this year, if assuming no exotic event or exogenous event that we can't anticipate, we'll probably have no increase in interest rates. We'll probably have growth at probably around 2.5% or so for the remainder of the year, which is acceptable to the markets. I don't know that there's a bubble that we know where it's going to be and it's going to burst anytime soon. When you see bubbles, you don't really know that you are in a bubble till it's over. And so we're probably in some bubble in some part of the economy. Probably the biggest bubble that I see is apartment buildings for billionaires in New York City. And someone told me the other day there's an oversupply of those apartments for billionaires, and now the prices are finally going to come down. But there's an incredible amount of apartments in New York for $50 million and above, and that might be a bubble. But wherever there's a bubble, eventually it'll get corrected. I hope there's not bubbles in larger parts of the economy than that one, though.
Well, certainly one impact or one consequence of quantitative easing is that it has, of course, inflated the assets that tend to be held by the wealthy. And the Bank of England, to my knowledge, is the only central bank in the world that's had the courage to actually do a study looking at the impact of quantitative easing on income inequality, and they concluded that 40% of the gains of quantitative easing had gone to the top 5%. I don't think the Fed has quite done a similar study or published it yet. But, how do you assess the risk of, potential financial instability going forward? Is that something that worries you?
I can tell you exactly how I assess those risks, which is I pick up the phone and call David. And he tells us whether or not to be worried. And I would distinguish, there's two types of things. There's always a lot of different asset markets, a lot of different things going on in the economy. Some of them may be undervalued, some of them may be overvalued. There's that whole part of the economy, and then there's what's actually happening, as I said before, what people are building, the homes. Every year, there's more people that are, despite how long people are staying with their parents, there still are some moving out. You need more houses. Some of the old houses deteriorate. You need to build them. So there's a whole range of activities in the real part of the economy. And when you look at the real part of the economy, the problem right now isn't a bubble. The problem is the opposite, that things haven't yet gotten back to where they are. One thing I want to pick up in terms of what David said is a lot of the macroeconomic policy we've seen has been that we had an extraordinary fiscal response up front. We had a stimulus very rapidly in January or February 2008 before anyone realized that the economy had slipped into a recession. We had a massive one in the form of the Recovery Act at the beginning of 2009. And I think less appreciated over the next couple of years, there were another dozen pieces of jobs legislation for teachers, hiring tax credits, infrastructure, extending payroll tax cuts that roughly doubled the original size of the Recovery Act. So you had this extraordinary fiscal response that in the initial stages of the recovery, when the normal drivers like housing were absent because of the deleveraging, you had the fiscal side. That basically came to an end, though. And in 2013, we had a huge fiscal contraction. We had, in a lot of respects, greater austerity in the United States in 2013 than anything the UK has seen. That's not something we wanted. We were trying to avoid that. And we still have a fiscal consolidation that's happening at a somewhat slower pace than it happened then, but faster than it should. That gives you one of the biggest no-brainers in public policy, which is investing more up front in areas like infrastructure while doing more deficit reduction in the medium and long run to pay for it, and you'd help solve both halves of that problem. So we've had, certainly I agree, an imbalance in the macroeconomic response because in terms of fiscal policy, we started out well, but we haven't been able to continue to follow up nearly as well as we would have liked to have.
I agree on infrastructure. Have anybody driven down the streets of Washington, D.C. lately? Anybody see any potholes there? New York City? Anybody ever try to drive from Washington to Dulles and have their cell phone not get cut off because the infrastructure isn't so good? The infrastructure sometimes I could be making a call in Ethiopia, and the cell phone coverage is much better than in Washington, D.C. In fact, when it breaks up, I usually tell people I'm in an emerging market country, Washington, D.C. But the truth is that we have underspent in infrastructure in the country for the last 5 or 10 years, and that's why our airports and our bridges and our roads and our cellular telephones and other things aren't as good as they often are in so-called emerging markets. And so we have to spend an enormous amount to catch up, and if we don't do so, I think we're going to be falling even further and further behind. The United States right now is still the largest economy in the world. We aren't going to be the largest economy in the world in the lifetime of most people here. China will eventually pass us. But in the lifetime of everybody here, we'll probably be the second or third largest economy in the world at least probably through the end of the century. And so it's a very strong economy. It's still the best place in the world to invest for lots of reasons I could describe. But we still have to deal with our infrastructure problems. And unfortunately, I think Congress doesn't want to address that issue. They seem to want not to really be committed to doing anything on infrastructure. And so the private sector has to do a lot of it, and the private sector isn't doing as much as it should either. One of the reasons corporate profits are so high is that we are underspending in R&D and underspending in capital expenditures. You can always get your profits up by not expending a lot of money on so-called capital expenditures and R&D, and that's what we're doing to prop up corporate profits unduly, in my view, to some extent. And we have to recognize that we can't just focus on quarterly earnings, because if we do, we're never going to really put the R&D money in and the infrastructure money and the CapEx spending money in that we need to.
But if we're talking about infrastructure, I mean, one of the other statistics I find fascinating is that if you look at what's happened across the Western world since 2007, the response of the Western world to a crisis created by too much debt has been to actually increase the overall debt as a proportion of GDP by 20 percentage points since 2007.
Well, we've shifted it from the private sector to the government sector.
Exactly. So debt has basically gone, as you say, from the private sector to the government sector. Now, the US has done a bit better than some of the European countries or Japan in that respect, but essentially deleveraging has not started yet in the US overall. Does that worry you?
I don't agree with some of those facts. If you look at interest payments as a share of disposable income, which is one measure as to how indebted households are, that's now the lowest since we started collecting those data in 1980. So I think for a lot of consumers, on average, a lot of the deleveraging has gone through.
But
and that's important.
In the private sector, yes, but not the public sector.
Oh, well, let's get to that in a second. Now, it's important, the caveat on average. The average is heavily weights those with millions and millions. It doesn't weight a lot those with tens of thousands. And equity markets have done a lot better than housing, for example. And at the top, most of your wealth is in equity. Mm-hmm. At the middle and the bottom, most of it's in housing. So you see some unevenness in the deleveraging. But on the consumer side, we've done pretty well. In terms of the federal government, we have increased our we have reduced our deficit, if anything, more quickly than the IMF would have told us to, than most economists would have told us to. As I said before, we cut our deficit by 2.7% of GDP last year. That's a scarily fast amount for an economy that is not fully recovered. We now have our deficit in the zone where our debt is declining as a share of our economy, which means it's moving in the right direction. Certainly nothing in the crisis in the United States, or really anywhere other than Greece or maybe one or two other countries, was caused by public indebtedness. I don't think that was the problem. I think it's clearly part of the solution. Last point I'd make, though, is infrastructure might even be the closest thing we have to a free lunch. Studies by the Fed and the IMF have both found that investing in infrastructure will add to your GDP, and it'll add so much that your debt might actually fall as a share of GDP, even if you borrow for that infrastructure, because our interest rates are so low and we have such needs.
So fixing the potholes of the free lunch all around. But David,
the closest thing we have.
In context, we have roughly $17 trillion of federal debt, internal and external debt, and not counting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unfunded liabilities, which vary depending on your assumptions from $60 to $90 trillion. But forget that. Say we just have $17 trillion of debt. We are probably staying even or maybe reducing as a percentage of GDP, but it's still a large amount of money, and we're adding $500 billion a year to it. Remember, under the Simpson-Bowles program, that was not designed to reduce the total amount of federal debt. That was only going to say that we're going to add 10 trillion over the next 10 years. Let's just add 6 trillion instead of 10 trillion. And of course, that program didn't get passed. So we're going to still add a lot of debt over the next 10 years or so. Maybe as a percentage of GDP, it'll be manageable. But one of the reasons it's manageable, to some extent, is interest rates have been so low. The federal government's now spending roughly $415 billion a year on interest payments. If interest rates go up, those interest rates the federal government's going to pay is going to go much higher. And if the interest rates we're paying are double what we're paying today, the federal government is going to have a bit more challenge to pay those interest rates, as you would admit. Yeah. So we've been blessed by having low interest rates because the federal government's been able to borrow money at very low rates. So as interest rates go up, that will be a bigger burden for our federal budget. And these are the same problems that other developed market countries have as well. The best thing that's happened in the last year or so, in my view, in the global economic situation is that Europe did not collapse. That was a big fear that we had about 2 years ago, that the euro would go out of business. Germany could pull out, some people might say, out of the euro. There was some sentiment about that. And that Spain would default on its debts, and that Italy would default on its debts, and Portugal would default on its debts. And that actually didn't happen. In fact, now there's been enough of a recovery, while their GDP growth rates aren't spectacular, there's enough of a recovery so that Spain is selling debt at a lower interest rate than the United States is selling. Now, I would rather have US debt than Spanish debt, but still, it does show you the markets have more confidence in Europe. Europe has an economy that's roughly the same as the United States. Our economy is roughly $17 trillion a year. European economy, which is much more people, twice as many people, is roughly $17 trillion a year. So they have an economy that's growing at under 1%, but the fact that it's not collapsing is really helping the world economy more than anything else that's happened probably in the last 2 years. And probably Mario Draghi, for a lot of his efforts, deserves a lot of the credit. The emerging markets are doing okay. They're not going to grow at quite the rate they did at let's say before the Great Recession happened, but they're growing at reasonably good rates. China is not going to grow at 10% again, but it's growing at 7%, and that's enough for them to be able to keep their economy in reasonably good shape. So I haven't really had a chance to talk about where I would invest money in this economy, and I'll do that later if you'd like.
Absolutely. No, I think we'd love to hear that. But
I just...
Sorry.
I was going
to say one thing to David, and I'd love to, is basically another explanation for Spanish yields being rock bottom low, of course, is that there's so much money swirling around the global economy as a result of,
I thought it was because the new king came in and he was so well-liked compared to the old king, no?
Well, let's all hope so. But anyway, sorry, Jason.
Oh, I want to spend just another moment on the debt, because I agree with you, David, that it's certainly a medium and long-run problem. But in a lot of respects, I think one of the underappreciated stories is how much we've done to deal with it. You never did Bowles-Simpson all at once, but you did the Affordable Care Act, which is over $1 trillion of deficit reduction. You did the Budget Control Act. You did the tax deal that raised rates on high-income households. You add all of those up, you add up the more favorable trend in health spending that we should come back and talk more about, because I think it's one of the underappreciated factors in the economy. And the Congressional Budget Office says, let's not look at where the debt and deficit is right now. Let's try to look at where it is in present value over a longer period of time. They have a measure called the fiscal gap, just how much you need to raise taxes or cut spending as a share of GDP today to stabilize the debt. The fiscal gap 5 years ago, before the recession, was between 5 and 10% of GDP. Their latest estimate of the fiscal gap is less than 2% of GDP. And a lot of that's because of that deficit reduction, and a lot of that's because of that favorable health trend. This fiscal gap depends enormously on interest rates, and all the forecasts we use, all the numbers we look at, assume a very large rise in interest rates, just like David was talking about. We build that in to the assumptions. If anything, I'll bet if you looked at our long-run interest rates, you would think we were being too conservative and had rates that were too high.
You know, when I worked in the White House, we managed to get inflation to 19%. If you could do that, you would be able to reduce this debt more quickly. And if I were to come back in government, I promise you I could get inflation up again, and that would reduce the real burden. Interestingly, we have squeezed the federal government in recent years. People may not believe this, but if you look at the statistics, under Ronald Reagan's term and under George W. Bush's term, the federal rate of spending went up about 8% a year. The federal government spending went up about 8% a year. Under President Barack Obama, the federal rate of spending is going up about 1.5% a year. So it hasn't been going up all that much. Eventually, I think we're going to have to increase federal spending because it's been, I think, kept artificially low because Congress doesn't really want to pass a lot of legislation or do a lot of things. If the rate does go up to a more normalized rate of 3 or 4% or 5% of federal spending growth a year, we're going to have deficit problems we're going to have to deal with. So yes, a lot of what you say is accurate. I just worry that if the inflation rate goes, if the interest rates go up and if federal spending goes up to more normalized rates, we could get back to trillion-dollar deficits again. Hopefully that won't happen.
Right. Well, I'm going to turn to the audience and ask questions in just a second, but before I do, just to give you a chance to collect your thoughts, I'd like to ask you both very quickly, a key theme of Aspen this year has been the turmoil in the Middle East. That obviously can have an impact on energy prices. How concerned are you that a sudden rise in oil prices or general geopolitical instability is going to derail this recovery? Who would like to jump in first? Jason?
I mean, it's something we take seriously. We monitor very closely. You haven't seen very much of an increase in oil prices following the latest round of instability in Iraq, but global events matter enormously for us. You've seen even things like production disruptions in Libya, the sanctions against Iran, the uncertainty associated with Syria, all of these types of factors affect oil prices. You've seen statements by the Saudis that they're willing to do what it takes to keep them stable. They have a lot of spare capacity. We have tools in the United States as well. One important thing, though, is how exposed our economy is to variations in the price of oil, and here it's a little bit different than when you were in the White House, David. Depends on how much oil we're producing here in the United States and how much we're importing. And we've seen something amazing in the last couple of years. We were importing, had net imports of 12 million barrels per day 5 or 6 years ago. We've cut that in half to 6 million barrels per day. Half of that has been increased U.S. production, an amount equivalent to discovering Iraq. Half of that has been reduced consumption, partly due to the recession, but an even bigger part due to the most fuel-efficient fleet we've seen on the road. No matter how much we improve our net exports, net imports of oil, we're still vulnerable to global prices, but you're less vulnerable if you're importing less, if you're producing more of it here, and most importantly, if you're using less oil. So there's a short run, but there's also a long run game here of continuing to reduce our dependence on
oil. Prices are not the biggest problem. People may forget this, but when we had the great oil shock in 73, 74, when the Israeli war occurred, and the boycott occurred, oil prices went up 400%. So there was a quadrupling. That isn't going to happen. And then it's not going to happen because there won't be a boycott, but also because the world is awash in oil right now. We have much more oil than we really need at any given moment. And as you indicate, the Saudis have a capacity probably to produce 12, 13 million barrels a day. They can produce anywhere between 8 and 13 and really affect the price of oil, and they're willing to do so. And there are a lot of other countries that can increase their capacity if they want to do so. I don't think that's the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem from what's going on in the Middle East now is an overall sense around the world that policies that the Western world has tried to pursue aren't really working. And this may produce a lack of confidence in Western governments and a lack of feeling that Western policies are really going to produce the solutions that we all want. And I just worry about there being recriminations about this policy, and that might produce further stalemate in the US government and other governments as well. Because business people, when they look at where they want to put their money and what they want to do, they want to see a functioning government. They don't want to see a government with all kinds of recriminations and all kinds of challenges and stalemating occurring. And I hope that if something adverse to our interests happens in Iraq, far more adverse than has happened already, we don't go into a recrimination policy and really, I think, slow down the economy because we're fighting with each other politically over what happened in Iraq. That's a bigger problem than oil prices going up to me.
That's certainly a theme which is going to be discussed a lot in the next few days, I'm sure. But let's turn to any of you who've got questions for David or for Jason. And if I can see hands going up already. 1, 2, 3. As ever, it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. And if you can keep your questions short or your statements short and to the point, that would be great, because I can see already about a dozen people who'd like to ask questions. So, sir.
Hi, my name is Sanjeev Sharma. My question is, why are we so worried about QE? And really, I have two observations here. One is, if you think of the Treasury and the Fed as the government, then all they did was they never issued the bonds, they just issued overnight bills. So there really is no flooding of pumping of liquidity, as you call it. It's like they never issued the bonds, they just issued the bills. That's one. Two, it's actually fiscally contractionary because they've bought 5% bonds and replaced it with 0% bills. So in fact, if you look at the numbers, that 12 trillion, a lot of, you've got a fiscally contractionary event going on. The last observation is, how could this be inflationary? The object in Japan for the last 15 years, the first time they did QE 15 years ago, they haven't been able to create inflation. In fact, I'd offer you should probably take Mr. Abe up and show him how to create that inflation.
All right, so are we wrong to worry about QE? I
Oh,
think I was probably the one who was worried more about QE than anyone else.
If what you say is true and everybody doesn't believe you, then what you say doesn't matter. In other words, everybody believes that QE3, when it ends and we begin to increase interest rates, it will have some inflationary impact. And so I think that's the conventional wisdom. And if that's the conventional wisdom, being right isn't as important as knowing what the conventional wisdom is. So if I think the conventional wisdom is different. You may be right and everybody else is wrong, but the conventional wisdom overwhelmingly is that interest rates will probably go up, that what the Fed did probably kept interest rates down. It was probably deflationary to some extent. I do think we could use more inflation. I think obviously, I'm not a great person to talk about it, but I think 3% inflation wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. In Japan, they haven't been able to produce inflation. Deflation is a much more pernicious problem than inflation. We know how to solve inflation. That's easy, relatively speaking. Deflation, no one really knows how to solve, and the Japanese have struggled with that for 2 decades, and we've been afraid that that would be a problem here. When that was a concern, I did go to Ben Bernanke and say, look, I can solve that problem. Bring me into the government, and I can get rid of deflation, but he never was interested.
I mean, yeah, for those of you who are monetary geeks, I would say do read the report coming out later today from the Bank for International Settlements, which talks a lot about deflation, a lot about QE, and has some pretty striking conclusions. But we have a question over there. Yes, 1 and then 2.
Steve Cumbie, question for David. If the minimum wage is increased to over $10 as the administration supports, what do you think the impact on GDP will be?
I personally think it would be relatively de minimis. I know there are some in the business community that fight the increase in the minimum wage, but there are many people in the business community who don't think it's going to have that big an impact. There aren't as many minimum wage workers as people once thought there was. And I don't think it's have the same impact that it would have had 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, because I just don't think there's the same percentage of people at the minimum wage as before. And since it's still well below where it should be in real terms, I don't think it'll have a big effect on GDP, at least in my view.
Right. Question over there. Sir.
I assume you agree.
I
sorry,
think it would
Jason,
have,
sorry,
if anything,
Jason,
a
sorry,
mild
yeah.
positive, because increased purchasing power of households that are likely to spend that money would be good for the economy, but it's not primarily motivated by macroeconomic considerations. It's motivated by having those families earn more.
I was going to ask about the minimum wage, but since he already asked it, I'll ask a different question. I have a question about European growth. We understand that the population growth is very slow, very low. They have a lower fertility rate than we do here in the U.S. So given that, how can they ever get their GDP growth up to, above 1%, back to 2% or 3%?
Well, they could move into the 21st century in some policies they have. They have policies that are wonderful social policies, but they are not going to be competitive with Asia as Asia begins to dominate the global economy. So they're going to just have to change some social networks that they have and change some of the other problems that they have to address. For example, you alluded to demographics. The demographics they have are serious problems. Right now, the average age in the United States is roughly 36. The average age in Europe is 41. And they are not, they're having a very high percentage of the population now over 65, much higher than the United States. And so unless they can produce younger people and have more younger people, and they're going to have increasingly higher amounts of money going to the social network they have and for the social benefits. So I think they're going to have to change their work rules. They're going to have to encourage people to start businesses, which they don't do as much of as I think they should. They're going to have to change the EU, because the EU is seen as too bureaucratic in many ways, but that's very difficult to do. Europe is going to limp along at reasonable growth rates, but I don't think it's going to be the economic engine of the world. That's going to be Asia to some extent. Europe will be very happy, I think, if it can grow at 2%. Right now, it's probably going to grow at under 1% this year. They've got to change a lot of policies. I think the best thing they could do would be to get a common fiscal and monetary policy for the EU, which they don't really have.
Jason, do you want to?
I think one of the easiest ways to grow as an economy is to have another economy that's much richer than you and catch up to them. Take some of their technology, take some of the fact that you don't have a lot of capital, and with some extra you can get a very high return. And if you look at the very rapid European growth in the 50s and 60s, much of it was that type of catching up. And as they get closer and closer to the frontier, and basically at it in many of the countries, that type of catch-up is no longer available. So I think one of the most troubling things in the European data isn't, again, any given quarter or given month's data. It's that the productivity growth rate in Europe has been falling continuously from 1950 through 2012. And I think in the United States that actually reversed. Ours was falling, and then it started to increase with the new economy in the 1990s, and you've seen it to some degree stay up. They haven't had that type of increase in Europe. So I think a lot of the types of policies and ideas David has talked about would help remedy that productivity growth. At the same time, growth is made from productivity and it's made from people. And in terms of people, there's 3 ways to get more of them: immigration, birth, or taking people you already have and encouraging them to work. Immigration might be part of the answer there. Birth is certainly something that France has actually done pretty successfully. And then Europe has very high labor force participation rates. They're much lower in terms of hours, and some of the distortions associated with labor markets may explain that third one.
As a place to invest, though, Europe is, in my view, fairly attractive now, because corporate assets are trading roughly 20% below comparable assets in the United States. And there's opportunities to buy companies there that you can't really find in the United States. And there's less competition now because many people pulled out of Europe as a place to invest. So as a place to invest, I think it's more attractive than as somebody who might be worried about the overall European future.
Right. Can I quickly ask, who else wants to ask a question, just so I can get an idea where most of the questions are coming from? Okay. Right, sir.
Good one, right? Larry Gies, real quick question. Labor participation rates, how concerned should we be about that? We always talk about unemployment, but if you look at the labor participation rates from 2000 in this country, our unemployment rate would actually be over 12%. How concerned should we be about that, and how have you gotten your arms around it?
We've spent a lot of time at the Council of Economic Advisors analyzing that question, and you look, the labor force participation rate has fallen by 3 percentage points since the recession began at the end of 2007. And two big things happened at once. One was people that were born in 1946, which is the beginning of the baby boom generation, turned 62 in 2008. That's when they first became eligible for Social Security, and you saw an increased wave of retirements. That factor is responsible for a little bit over half of the decline in the labor force participation rate. The second factor is whenever your economy is hit with a recession, that manifests itself as unemployment going up and some people being discouraged or maybe staying in school longer and not entering. That factor is responsible for about a quarter of the decline in the labor force participation rate. That leaves another quarter unexplained. I think there's two types of things going on there. One is trends that predated the Great Recession. If you look at prime age men, 25 to 54, their labor force participation rate has been falling since 1953, continuously for 60 years, year in and year out. For prime age women, 25 to 54, it's been falling since 1999. Those trends carried themselves forward, and there's something I think we should be worried about. Then the last thing is, I think there's some things unique to the Great Recession that have taken a greater toll on labor markets than you normally see in the wake of a recession. And I think you see that in terms of long-term unemployed, which is twice what it was going into the recession, even though the short-term unemployment rate has recovered. And I think you also see that in terms of fewer people re-entering the labor force than you'd want to see. So I think these are a bunch of different factors. They all have different answers, which is recover the economy, encourage more people to participate, and things like immigration reform, paid leave that would remedy the longer run trend.
Well, you don't know for those who may not have understood exactly what was being asked, generally we've had, since World War II, I'd say roughly 66% of the adult workforce in working. In other words, the people eligible to work was about 66% more or less, and it's gone down to about 63%. So if it was at 66% now, and those people could not really find jobs, the unemployment rate would be much higher. But because it's only 63% of the workforce who are really employed or really looking for jobs, the unemployment rate is lower than it would otherwise be. The real question to me is, are we going to accept an unemployment rate more or less of 6%? When I went to college, the standard textbook said that full employment was more or less 4%. Today, I think we're on the verge of beginning to think that full employment might be 5 to 6%. And if we accept that, that's, I think, not so good because, in effect, we're accepting a lower goal to be able to get people to work. And I hope we don't accept 6% as the standard, but we're beginning to get close to that because we seem to be unable to get the unemployment rate below 6.3% or so. And maybe people know when you talk about the unemployment rate, you're really talking about people who've looked for jobs in the last month. So if you didn't look for a job and you're not really part of the workforce, you're not counting those numbers. Then the marginally attached numbers, in other words, the people who sort of would be looking for work if they thought there was work, is more or less about 12%, I think. Is that the marginally attached unemployment rate's now about 12%. We don't focus on those numbers so much, but that's really a much more important number to me because that really takes into account the people who would like to work or would look for work if they thought there was a chance to get one. And I hope we don't accept, and generally we, being the whole government, doesn't accept a 6% unemployment rate as being full.
Right, we've just got a few more minutes left, and if who's going to save me from asking David where he would invest his money now? But that was your question, right? Well, do you want to ask it, or? Oh. Okay, all right, I'm going to ask it.
Okay.
And then we have one question
okay.
back.
Talk about his investment recommendations if we had time. So.
Okay. Well, I put 100% in private equity.
I should say the last time I asked David this on a platform, I asked him where he would invest, and then I asked him where he wouldn't invest. And when I asked him where he wouldn't invest, he turned around and said to me immediately, the media.
I said newspapers, actually. But to be very brief, the United States is by far still the best place in the world to invest. The rule of law, transparency, governance, opportunity to exit transactions, just nothing is comparable to the United States. We're going to have modest growth rates, but I still would put the bulk of my investment assets in the United States, public equities, public fixed income, some alternatives. If you have the courage to invest outside the United States, and I think people should, I think the emerging markets have been beaten down a bit and probably are unduly depressed in value, and I think there's some bargains there, particularly in Asia, which is going to be growing at very, very high rates. I think Europe, as I mentioned, is still pretty cheap right now. It's a developed market, not going to have high growth rates, but asset prices are pretty low. In terms of sectors, nothing is more impressive to me right now than carbon-related energy. We are going to have to increase the amount of energy we produce in the world by the year 2035 by about a third from where we are today, increase it by a third. And we're going to have to do that by producing more oil, more gas, and other kinds of energy. And as the emerging markets emerge, they have enormous appetite for more energy, and they have to import a lot of it. So investing in carbon-related energy, exploration and production, transportation, distribution, storage, I think is the single best place in the world to invest right now. Second, I would say, is healthcare. As the baby boomers begin to age, they will spare no expense on their artificial hips, artificial knees, transplants, whatever they might need. When I worked in the White House, 7% of the GDP in the United States was devoted to healthcare. Now it's about 18%, the highest percentage in the world. The OECD countries are about half of that, 8 to 9%. So we spend an enormous amount on healthcare, and I think there's going to be an increasing percentage spent in healthcare as the baby boomers, the richest generation in the country's history, has this money, and they're going to, as they age, they're going to spend the money. And because the Affordable Care Act and other things, I think there'll be a lot of opportunities there. The third one I'll mention, the last one, would be the food chain and the food supply. Right now, we have roughly 7 billion people on the face of the earth. Before I'm projected to die actuarially, there'll be about 9 billion people on the face of the earth. There were 2.5 billion people on the face of the earth when I was born. And these people who are coming onto the world, they're mostly in the emerging markets. 85% of the population of the world is in the emerging markets. And they want better food, they want higher food quality, and they're willing to, and they will be able to pay for it. And the ability to produce more food and to transport it there, I think will be a great opportunity to take advantage of the emerging middle class in the emerging markets, particularly things related to food supply.
And I can just tell you that I invest in the only way that I'm legally allowed to, which is buying and holding index funds, and that saves me enormous amounts in fees and from making all sorts of mistakes you'd otherwise make in exchange for paying those high fees.
Well, that seems a good. I think we are pretty much out of time.
Not Carlisle, of course.
Seems like a good.
You get what you pay for in life, you know?
Exactly. Well, I must say, I mean, it's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, I guess my three takeaways are: one, that you are both quite optimistic that there is growth underway. Two, that the question today, though, really is what kind of growth we're seeing and who's benefiting, rather than just whether or not we have growth. And then three, the question of what happens, not if, but when interest rates go up, is something that we all need to watch pretty carefully. So,
well, the best thing to do is see if you can invest in the Ideas Festival the Aspen Institute has. That's the biggest growth thing that I've seen recently, and if you can invest in that, you'll probably make a lot of money.
Great, thank you.